turn out one more light just to make sure that everybody can see the screen. Is that okay for everybody, that amount of lighting? Yeah? Okay, so the last little aspect of the Middle Ages was something called Barasenso, the Wars of the Roses. So I'll give a little bit of background showing how Henry Tudor, Henry Nanase, Henry VII, how he became the king. The Wars of the Roses. You've heard this name probably, Barasenso, it's very famous. It wasn't just one war, wars. There were several periods of fighting, and then peace, and then fighting, and then peace. And it was because there were whoa. Okay. Okay, let me just get to Edward III, going back into the 14th century, 14世紀の Edward 3世. At this time, England was one of the most powerful countries in Europe. That would change. That's not going to continue. But at this time, it's a powerful country, and he's a very powerful king. And what happened was that when he died, he had two sons who were both their families said, we should be king, and then their children saying the same thing, we should be king, and then their grandchildren, and so it went on. It kept having competition and fighting for who was going to rule the country. So the way this develops is that you've got John of Gaunt and Edmund, the Duke of York, are the two sons, and the House of Lancaster, which is John of Gaunt's family. House, in this case, basically means family. It doesn't mean yet. It means the family of Lancaster. They were controlling the country for part of the time, and then the House of York, the descendants of Edmund, they controlled the country for this next period. But they were fighting for control between them. And the Wars of the Roses end with our Henry Nanase, who is the first king of our period. And he did it because he belonged to the House of Lancaster, and he killed the House of York king, Richard. Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, and Henry married Richard's niece. Okay. Now this is, you may think, ちょっとひどいみたいね、おじさんのことごめんなさいね、結婚しよう。She just says, oh, 別に好きではなかったいいよ。Okay? So she didn't seem to be too bothered that he'd, her future husband had killed her uncle. As I say, he wasn't a very popular man, and I think the English people in general were quite happy that he was not the king anymore. So Henry came in as a popular king, and he united the two families by marriage. If you studied any history at all, you probably know that the two ways of uniting people, one way is to fight and beat them, and the other way is to marry. Okay, so marriage was a very important reason. It's also, remember, we talked about England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. It's also an important way of bringing countries together. a prince has to marry a princess. Where's he going to find one? Has to find a princess from another country. Right? So that unites those countries. Very often, marriage was more effective than war for bringing countries and people together. So, yes, I did have... Edward was he's this very powerful king. So he's the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. And then Richard, the unpopular Richard III, he's very famous in Shakespeare's play. He's presented as a hunchback. A hunchback is like this. Okay, and okay, his niece was lucky. She survived to marry Henry VII, but his two little nephews, were locked up in the Tower of London, and the story is that Richard killed those little boys. Personally, no, but he told soldiers, go and kill them. That's the story. So, we don't really know. Okay, historians disagree about it. Did he really murder his nephews? The reason would be so that later on they would not challenge him to become king. Okay, if there's no family, no challenge, he can continue as king for a long time. But no, he was killed by Henry. So that's the kind of image that he was this kind of hunchback with a kind of ijiwaru, sort of, are you my nephew? Are you my nephew? You don't want to be. You certainly don't want to be my nephew, okay? Because the chances are I'm going to kill you. All right? So that's Richard III. And we do know a little bit about him, but we're not sure about the question of whether he murdered his nephews. But we do know that he did have some kind of a hunch, because his bones were discovered. They found his bones quite recently, 6 years ago. Funnily enough, it was in a car park. They were fixing the car park, and Richard-san's here. Okay, so that's him, and you can see in this picture as well. It does look as if he had something under his right shoulder like that. He had some sort of a. Okay, it looks as if he did have some kind. And the skeleton did have something that showed that he would have been. Perhaps not a hunchback on his back, but something on his shoulder. So that part was true. Okay. So Henry kills Richard, marries Richard's nephew, and starts to become king. So he marries Elizabeth, and this unites the two houses. Remember, these two families, they call it the House of Lancaster and the House of York. These two families are now united through Henry, and the Wars of the Roses end. Now, these two families together were called the Plantagenet dynasty, Plantagenet rule. And that ends now, and a new rule starts. Henry's Myorji is Tudor. It's not Lancaster, it's his Myorji, his family name is Tudor. And he comes from an old Welsh family. So that's again important. Wales is already connected with England, but the Welsh people can feel proud. The King of England is a Welshman. Okay, that's kind of important in uniting the two countries. So, as I said, roughly speaking, the beginning of the Tudor period is clearly the end of the Middle Ages. we're into a new Jedi. The two languages had grown together, and the Normans don't exist as a distinct ethnic or cultural group. People will, if you go to Britain now, people will say, yes, I'm Celtic. Or, no, I'm basically Anglo-Saxon. But nobody will say, I'm Norman. Just people don't think about that. It is probably true, imademo, that some of the very high-class families of England are Norman origin, but sono kangai kata wa nai. Everybody is mixed in to some extent. So there's no real group of Norman people anymore. They've all mixed in. Everybody's English. The Wars of the Roses had made these people stronger, the serfs, and it had made these people, the lords, the high class, the elite, weaker. So society was not so structured, not so strictly structured as it had been before. The merchant class had become strong, so the middle class was gaining in power, and the feudal system, this pyramid structure, was basically ending. And of course, this is also the time of the Renaissance. Renaissance, namae wakaru kedo. Do you know the meaning of Renaissance? Re in English very often means again, like return. Okay, for example, re means again, and naissance is the French word for birth. Rebirth. Okay, so Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Renaissance equals rebirth, but what is it? What is being reborn? What is reborn in the Renaissance? Does anybody have any idea? Okay, Renaissance equals rebirth. But what? Rebirth of what? Anybody want to tell me? Anybody got any ideas? Nobody wants to take a risk? No, maybe you don't know. Go back, Singnim Mai. The big power in Europe, exactly, the Roman Empire, yes. And before the Romans, the Greeks, all right? Now, for 1,000 years, much of the culture of the Greeks and the Romans was lost to Europe. And it was only known in Byzantium, Constantinople, Imanot. Okay, basically it was sort of right over in the eastern part of Europe. Okay. And because the Arabic or the Islamic, well, actually the Turkish people are not Arabs, so but because of that kind of Islamic invasion really into that area, those people had to run away and go more into Europe. A lot of them went to Italy, and they were very educated. They knew their history. They knew about the Greek and Roman culture. They had a lot of books and a lot of detail, and so the Greek and Roman culture were reborn in Europe after a period when a lot of it had been lost. So it's the rebirth of Greek and Latin culture. Okay, so that's something that's going on in Europe at this time. So, what kind of king was Henry? Firstly, he wanted to make his power strong. So he said that he was the king from the day before the battle, the day before killing Richard. So everybody fighting for Richard was going against the king. Okay, so the king shows, you went against me and I was the true king, and really you should die, but I'm a nice guy. I won't kill you all. But just remember, okay, you did bad. So he promised that they wouldn't be punished if they followed him korikara from now on. He made successful trade agreements for importing and exporting goods with France and Holland, and Netherlands. Okay. And he had a strict system of collecting taxes. Okay, Zekin was being collected. Okay, you owe me this money, you owe me this money. The tax man would come. We want your money, and so he made the country rich. All right, and in those days, if the king was making money, the king would keep that money. All right, now it's like the country's money, but it would be like his personal money. He was rich. He made the country rich, and he made himself rich. And he kept the peace. It was a peaceful time. What's more, and again, marriage, very important, Henry's daughter married the King of Scotland. Okay, that will be very important later on. Notice the family name Stuart. And remember, we are studying the Tudor kings and queens and the Stuart kings and queens. The children, grandchildren, okay, through the generations, later on will become kings and queens of England. Okay? And his son marries the Spanish prince Catherine of Aragon, and he makes an alliance with Germany. So he's very good at kind of making good relationships with other countries. Scotland, England, and Wales are now fairly closely friends. Spain is quite close because of this marriage to Arthur. Things are looking good. But then he dies. And he had a large personal fortune, but his son, Henry VIII, was very different from his father. Henry VIII said, lots of money! Let's spend. Okay? He had a lot of fun spending the money that his father had worked hard to collect. And the economy of the country grew weaker because, again, very different from his father, Henry VIII liked fighting. He liked wars. And so a lot of that money went paying for war, because war was an expensive business. So the economy did badly under Henry. But of course, Henry VIII, he's the famous one, isn't he? Everybody knows, oh, Henry Hasse. You know, he's just, got a strong image of this man. And the two marriages had important results, as I said. The daughter's marriage was to the King of Scotland, so the Stuarts later became kings of England. And the other marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, well, she married Arthur. And have you ever heard of Arthur? Arthur Tudor? You probably haven't heard of Catherine because he died. He died quite quickly. Hi. We're working our way through the prints here, and we're kind of beginning. You know, we're on this part here. Okay, all right. So Henry died, and then eventually Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII. She was his first wife. Do you know how many wives he had? 6 wives. The 6 wives of Henry VIII. Okay, very famous. He had 6 wives. Of course, you know, one after the other. He wasn't allowed to marry 2 people at the same time. He had one wife after the other. But only after the father died. He was not happy with having Henry marrying Catherine. So that was important too, because she married Henry VIII after Arthur died and had a child, Mary, who also became queen. All right? So both marriages had important consequences.